In the late summer of 1953, two boys from a quiet stretch of farmland in eastern Ontario walked into the woods behind a hayfield and did not come back out for almost 4 hours. When they finally did come stumbling back through the cedar rails of the fence behind the barn, they were pale, they were quiet, and they were holding something neither of them would ever describe in full. To another living person, not to their parents, not to the police constable who came up from the village the next morning, and not to the two men in dark coats and dark cars who arrived 3 days later and stayed for almost a week. Within 10 days of the boys finding what they found, the place was sealed. Within 2 weeks, it was buried under fresh fill brought in by trucks that came at night. Within a month, the topsoil had been turned, the brush had grown back, and the only people who knew exactly where the entrance had been were the two boys, the constable who never spoke of it again, the men in the dark coats whose names appeared on no document. Anyone in the county was ever shown, and the farmer who owned the land, when asked about it years later by his own grandson, would only say that some things in this country were buried for a reason, and some men dug them up anyway and never came home the same. The boys grew up. One of them stayed in the county and farmed his father's land until he was 84. The other left for Toronto, worked in a freight office for almost 40 years, and never once returned to the place where he had lived as a child. Neither of them gave a single newspaper interview. Neither of them wrote anything down that anyone has ever found. And yet, in the small towns along that quiet road in the Canadian Shield, people still talk in low voices about what those two boys saw underground in 1953, what the men in the dark coats took away with them, and what is, even now, more than 70 years later, still down there beneath the fill and the cedar roots and the long Ontario silence. Before we go any further, settle in, get comfortable, dim your lights, and if you are listening to this to drift off to sleep, you have come to the right place, because we are going to take this slowly, gently, all the way down. If you find these forgotten Canadian stories soothing, if you like the kind of history that nobody talks about anymore, the kind that lives in the cracks between the official record and the things rural families pass down at the kitchen table over cold tea, please consider subscribing to the channel and ringing the little bell beside the subscribe button, because that is how these stories find their way to other quiet listeners on quiet nights all across the country and beyond. It costs nothing, it takes only a moment, and it lets us keep wandering together into the older, stranger, softer corners of this land. So go ahead, tap subscribe, ring the bell, and then come back, lay your head down, close your eyes if you would like, and let us walk back together to a summer afternoon in eastern Ontario in the year 1953, when two boys in canvas sneakers and patched trousers stepped off a hayfield and into something that nobody in this country has been allowed to talk about since. The county was Hastings. The township, for the sake of this telling, we will call by the name the older people used, a hollow of farmland and second-growth bush sitting on the southern lip of the Canadian Shield, where the soft farmland of the lake plain runs up against the old hard granite of the older country to the north. You know the feeling of it, even if you have never been. The fields are small. The rocks come up through the topsoil in long gray backs, like the spines of animals sleeping just under the grass. The cedars grow thick along the fence lines. The barns lean a little. The houses are white clappered with green trim, or gray clappered with no trim at all, and the wood smoke from the cook stoves drifts low across the fields in the cool of the evening, even in August. Hastings County in 1953 was a place that had already been settled for more than 100 years, and yet it was still, in many of its corners, half wilderness. The roads were gravel. The phone lines did not reach every concession. The nearest town with a doctor was sometimes a 40-minute drive by truck. And the bush, the great rolling bush of cedar and pine and birch and granite outcrop that stretched away to the north toward Algonquin and beyond, The bush was full of things that no map had ever quite caught up with. Old logging camps, abandoned trapper cabins, half-collapsed pioneer wells, the pits and shafts and tailing heaps of the small gold rush of 1866, which had brought men by the hundreds into these hills for a few feverish years, and then released them all again, leaving holes in the ground that the bush had been quietly closing over for almost 90 years by the time those two boys went walking into the trees. The boys we will call Marcel Tremblay and Davy Robichaud, because those were close enough to their real names that the people who remember will know who we are talking about, and far enough away that the families they left behind can keep what privacy they have left. Marcel was 12, Davy was 11 and a half. They were cousins on their mother's side, both descended from one of the small French-Canadian families that had drifted south and east from Quebec generations earlier and settled into the bilingual hollows of Hastings and Renfrew, where French names and English names sat side by side on the rural mail boxes, and nobody much cared which side of the line your grandfather had come from. Marcel lived on his father's farm. Davy lived 3 concessions over with his mother, his father having died in the war 8 years before. The two boys spent every summer together. They fished the creek that ran along the back of the Tremblay property. They built lean-tos out of cedar boughs in the bush above the hayfield. They knew that bush, or thought they knew it, the way only farm boys can know a piece of land, which is to say they knew the visible parts of it, the trails and the clearings and the rock outcrops and the deer beds, and they assumed, the way children assume, that what was visible was all there was. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The hay was in. The corn was up. There was nothing pressing for either of them to do until milking time at 5. They had eaten lunch at the Tremblay. Kitchen table, cold ham and bread, and the last of the previous summer's strawberry preserves, and at about 1 o'clock they had stepped out the back door, crossed the yard, climbed the cedar rail fence at the edge of the hayfield, and walked north into the bush. They were not looking for anything in particular. They had taken with them a piece of binder twine, a jackknife that Marcel's father had given him for his 11th birthday, 2 apples, and a small tin can of matches, because it was a thing the men in their family had always told them. Never go into the bush without something to start a fire with, even on the warmest day, because the bush in this country does not always behave the way you expect, and a boy who cannot make a small flame is a boy who is at the mercy of the weather. They walked north for about half an hour. They crossed the creek at the place where the old beaver dam had been the previous spring. They walked up the long slope of granite that ran along the back of the property, the slope that the older men in the family called the Lion's Back because of the way the rock humped up out of the moss in 3 long ridges, like the shoulders of a great cat lying down. They sat on the top of the Lion's Back for a while, ate one of the apples between them, and then instead of turning back south toward the farm, the way they always did, Davy said something that he would think about for the rest of his life. Davy said, "Let us go further today. Let us go all the way to the cedar swamp." The cedar swamp lay about a mile further to the north, in a low hollow between 2 long ridges of granite, in a part of the bush the boys had been told all their lives to stay away from. It was not, as far as anyone in the family had ever said, a dangerous place in any specific way. There were no bears denning there that the men knew of. The bog was not deep enough to swallow a person. The story, as it had come down to the boys, was simply that the cedar swamp was old. Older than the farm, older than the township, older than the gold rush, older than the United Empire Loyalists who had come up through the Bay of Kent in the 1790s, older than the French traders who had come down out of Quebec before them. The cedar swamp, the older men said, was older than anything any white man had any business knowing about, and the smart thing to do was to skirt around the east side of it on your way north and to leave the swamp itself alone. Marcel knew the rule, so did Davy, but it was a hot afternoon in August. They had 3.5 hours before they had to be back for chores. The apples were eaten, the sun was high, and the cedar swamp from the top of the lion's back looked like nothing so much as a dark green dimple in the bush, a place of cool shade and standing water and old trees, exactly the kind of place that draws a boy on a hot day, the way a magnet draws a piece of iron filing. Marcel said all right. They climbed down off the granite ridge, and they walked north into the cedar. The cedar swamp, when they reached the edge of it, was not really a swamp in the way the word usually means. It was a low forested basin between the ridges, floored with sphagnum moss and old fallen cedar trunks, with shallow black water standing in pools here and there between the trees, and with the living cedars themselves growing tall and thin and very close together, so that walking into the swamp from the bright August sunlight was like walking into a green cathedral with a low green ceiling and a soft green floor and a cool damp green silence that seemed to swallow the sound of the boys breathing the moment they passed under the first of the trees. They walked carefully. They stepped from moss hummock to moss hummock to keep their feet out of the black water. They did not speak much. There is a quality to the silence inside a cedar swamp in late summer that makes children quiet without their quite knowing why. They went perhaps 200 yards into the swamp before Marcel stopped and pointed at the ground. There was sticking up out of the moss in front of them a corner of something that was not wood and was not granite. It was a flat slab of gray stone about 3 feet across at the visible edge, with a straight side, a true straight side, of the kind that does not occur in nature. Granite outcrops come up out of the moss all through the Canadian Shield, but they come up rounded, weathered, irregular, the way water and ice have left them over 10,000 years. This stone was not rounded. This stone had a corner. This stone had been worked. Marcel knelt down beside it and pushed the moss away with his hands. The slab was bigger than he had thought. It was perhaps 4 feet by 6 feet, lying almost flat in the moss, with its long edge running east and west, and its surface, when he had cleared the moss off it, was smooth, in a way that no glacial stone was ever smooth. It had tool marks on it, faint, weathered, but tool marks all the same, the long shallow grooves of something that had been worked with metal, perhaps with a chisel, perhaps with something else, but worked, finished, set into the ground deliberately by a human hand. Davy said, "What is it?" Marcel said, "I do not know." Davy said, "Is it a grave?" Marcel said, "I do not think so. There is no cross. There is no name." Davy said, "Let us look around." They looked around. The first stone was not the only stone. Once they knew what they were looking for, once their eyes had learned the trick of seeing the difference between glacial stone and work stone in the green half-light of the swamp, they began to see them everywhere. There was another slab 6 feet to the east of the first one, smaller, but cut the same way. There was a third slab to the north, half buried, with its visible edge as straight as a ruler. And there was, when they looked very carefully into the moss between the slabs, a slight depression in the swamp floor, a long, shallow, rectangular depression about 10 feet by 15 feet, with the slabs arranged around its edge, almost as if the slabs were the rim of a sunken pit, and the moss had grown in over the top of the pit and closed it over the way. Pond ice closes over a hole in the spring. Marcel said, "This is something." Davy said, "Let us go home and tell." Marcel said in a moment. He took out his jackknife. He pushed the point of the blade down through the moss in the center of the depression. He expected to hit dirt within an inch or two, the way you always do in the swamp. The blade went down to the hilt without hitting anything. He pulled it out and pushed it down again 2 feet over. The blade went down to the hilt without hitting anything. He looked at Davy. Davy looked at him. They both understood with the wordless clarity that children sometimes have about these things that there was a hollow space beneath them, that the moss they were standing on was not floor at all but ceiling, and that under their canvas sneakers, under their patched trousers, under the soft green skin of the cedar swamp, there was a room. It took them almost an hour to find the way in. They circled the depression. They tested the moss with the jackknife. They felt with their hands along the edges of the slabs, looking for an opening, a crack, a place where the cover had failed. They found it at the north end of the depression, where the largest of the slabs had shifted at some point, perhaps in some old frost heave of some old winter long before either of them had been born, and had cracked along a diagonal line, leaving a triangular opening about 18 inches across at its widest, an opening that had been hidden under the moss until Marcel pushed the moss aside and found his hand passing through into cool air. The air that came up out of the opening was colder than the swamp air. It was much colder. It smelled, Davy said later. In the only thing he ever said about it to anyone other than Marcel, it smelled like the inside of a stone church. It smelled like winter. It smelled like something that had been closed for a very long time. They knelt at the opening. They looked at each other. Marcel said, "I am going down." Davy said, "I am coming with you." Marcel said, "Someone has to stay up here." Davy said, "No, we both go, because if one of us gets stuck, the other one will need help, and if both of us get stuck, at least we will be together." Marcel thought about this and agreed. They went down feet first, one after the other. Marcel first, lowering himself through the triangular crack in the slab, his canvas sneakers feeling for purchase in the dark below, his hands gripping the edge of the stone, his chest scraping the underside of the slab as he eased himself through. He dropped after a moment of dangling, perhaps 4 feet, and his feet hit a hard flat surface that rang slightly under the impact, the way a flagstone floor rings, not the soft gyve of dirt. He stood up. The top of his head did not touch the ceiling. He could not see anything. The light from the opening above him fell in a single triangular shaft onto the floor at his feet, and beyond that shaft the dark of the chamber was complete. He called up to Davy. Davy came down the same way, dangling, dropping, landing beside him with a small sound. They stood close together. They lit one of the matches from the tin can. What they saw in the light of that one match, and then in the light of the next match, and the next, and then in the light of a small fire they built on the stone floor out of dry cedar twigs. They had to climb back up and gather and pass back down through the opening. What they saw in the chamber under the cedar swamp in Hastings County on a Tuesday afternoon in August of 1953 was something that neither of them ever fully described to another human being, but that we can piece together in the slow, careful way these things have to be pieced together, from the few small things they did say, from the words their wives and their grandchildren would later remember them, muttering in their sleep, from the questions the men in the dark coats asked the constable when they arrived 3 days later, and from the patterns of other chambers in other parts of this country and other parts of the world that other people have found and not always been allowed to talk about. So let us go down into that chamber with them now, slowly, gently, by the light of the small cedar fire, and let us see what it was that those 2 boys saw. The floor under their feet was flagstone, not the rough field stone of a pioneer cellar, not the river rock of a settler's foundation. Flagstone, cut flagstone, dressed flagstone, fitted flagstone, each piece perhaps 2 feet square, each piece set flush against the next, with a joint so tight that Marcel, kneeling down with the match in his hand, could not slip the edge of his jackknife into the seam. The floor was level. The floor was old. There was a film of fine dust on it, but no leaves, no animal droppings, no roots pushing up through the cracks, because there were no cracks. The chamber had been closed long enough that the surface dust had settled out of the air and lay gray and undisturbed on every flat surface, and yet it had been closed tight enough that nothing organic had ever made its way in to disturb it. The walls of the chamber, when the boys held their small fire up to them, were stone as well. Not slab, coarse. Coarse stone, fitted stone, the kind of masonry that requires not only tools, but training. The kind of masonry that takes a man years to learn how to do, where each block is shaped to fit each neighbor, and the whole wall stands together by the geometry of the cuts, rather than by any mortar between them. There was no mortar between the stones of the chamber. There did not need to be. The cuts were that good. The chamber, as best the boys could tell by walking the length and the width of it with the small fire held up in their hands, was a rectangular room about 20 feet long and 12 feet wide. The ceiling, which was the underside of the slabs they had been standing on up above, was about 7 feet from the floor in the middle and slightly lower at the edges, because the ceiling slabs were laid flat and the floor sloped very slightly down toward the center, in the way a stone floor will if its builder wants water that gets in to gather in one place and not spread out everywhere. There was, at the center of the floor, a small round hole, about the size of a silver dollar, that disappeared down into a darkness the small fire could not reach. The boys did not put their hands near that hole. There was no smell coming out of it. There was no sound. There was only the suggestion that the chamber went deeper than they could see, that the room they were standing in was not the bottom of the thing they had found, that under their feet was something else that they were not going to find that afternoon, and that, as it would turn out, they were never going to find, because what came next did not give them the time. On the walls of the chamber, by the light of the small fire, the boys saw markings, not paintings, not pictures of animals or people of the kind that Aboriginal rock art is sometimes shown to have in books. Markings of a different kind, geometric, linear, cut into the stone with what must have been a metal tool, because no stone tool, no antler tool, no bone tool would have left lines that sharp and that even in coursed sandstone, and yet not the cut lines of any alphabet either of the boys had ever seen in school. The markings ran in horizontal bands around the chamber at about eye level for a grown man, which was a little above eye level for Marcel and well above eye level for Davy, so that the boys had to hold the fire up high to see them clearly. There were 3 bands. The top band was made up of short vertical strokes, in groups of 3 and 5 and 7, with longer horizontal strokes between the groups. The middle band was made up of curving lines, spirals, S-shapes, and what looked, when Marcel tilted his head, like the outline of a fish, and beside the fish, another fish, and beside that, one another, a whole school of small fish, swimming in a single direction around the room, all in the same slow swimming line. The bottom band was made up of squares and triangles, arranged in patterns that repeated, and then changed, and then repeated, again, the way a tile floor will sometimes do, and yet not exactly like that either, because every so often, in the middle of the pattern, there was a single mark that did not belong to the pattern, a small cross, a small circle with a dot inside it, a small star with 5 points, set into the geometry of the squares and triangles, like a signature left by the person who had cut them. There was a stone bench along one of the long walls of the chamber, low and broad, also of coursed and fitted masonry, with its top surface dressed smooth. There was nothing on the bench. There was a stone basin set into the floor at the eastern end of the chamber, perhaps 2 feet across and a foot deep, also dry, also empty, also clean of any film or stain, as though whatever had once been put into it had been carefully cleaned out by the last person who had used the chamber before they closed it up. There was, on the wall opposite the bench, a niche cut into the masonry, about a foot wide and about a foot deep and about 2 feet off the floor. There was something in the niche. Davy saw it first. Davy was the shorter of the 2 boys, and the niche was at his eye level, and as the small cedar fire flared up briefly in Marcel's hands, Davy stopped and pointed and said, "Look." Marcel looked. There was set into the back of the niche, leaning against the stone, a single object about the size and the shape of a man's forearm, but flat, not round, with a slight curve along its length, like a long, thin spoon without a handle, made of metal. The metal had a dull greenish dark color, the color that very old copper takes on after a long time without air, after it has slowly given itself up to the slow chemistry of stone and dust. Marcel reached into the niche, very slowly, very carefully, and picked the object up. It was heavier than he had expected. It was cold. It had been worked. There were small lines hammered into the surface of it, the same kind of geometric lines that ran around the walls of the chamber, the squares and triangles, and the small cross, and the small circle, with the dot inside it. There was a hole at one end, a small clean round hole, as though it had once been hung from a cord, perhaps around a neck, perhaps from a hook on the wall, perhaps from a beam of wood that was no longer there. Marcel held it in both hands. He looked at Davy. Davy said, "Put it back." Marcel said in a moment. Davy said, "Put it back. Marcel, we should not be here. Put it back." And Marcel, slowly, with a strange reluctance he did not understand and would never quite be able to explain, put the copper object back into the niche, leaned it against the stone exactly the way they had found it, and stepped back. That was when they heard the sound. It was not a loud sound. It was, in fact, very quiet. It came from the small round hole in the center of the floor. It was the sound, Davy said years later in the one and only sentence he ever spoke about it to his own daughter, of someone breathing in a room very far below, the room you are standing in. A long, slow breath in, a long, slow breath out. Once, twice, then nothing. Marcel said, "We are going." Davy said yes. They scrambled back across the flagstone floor toward the triangular opening in the ceiling. Marcel cupped his hand around the small cedar fire and lowered it carefully to the stone basin and let it die there rather than carry it back up with him. They reached up to the opening. Marcel boosted Davy up first, lifting him with both hands under his armpits until Davy's chest cleared the slab and Davy could scramble the rest of the way up on his elbows. Then Davy reached down for Marcel, and Marcel jumped and caught Davy's wrists, and Davy pulled, and Marcel kicked his feet against the wall of the chamber and worked his way up through the triangular crack, scraping his belly against the underside of the slab, and tumbled out onto the moss of the cedar swamp into the soft green sunlight of an August afternoon in 1953. They sat on the moss for a long time. Neither of them spoke. The swamp around them was as it had been, cool and damp and green and silent. The opening in the slab, now that they were lying beside it looking down, was just a triangular shadow at the edge of a long, flat stone, easy to miss if you did not know it was there. Marcel reached over and pulled a handful of moss across the opening, and then another, until the opening was hidden again the way it had been hidden when they came across it. Davy watched him do this and did not ask why he was doing it, because he understood, the way Marcel understood, that this was not a thing to leave lying around for the next person to find. They walked back south through the cedar swamp, up over the lion's back, down through the bush, across the creek at the old beaver dam place, and along the back of the hayfield, and they climbed the cedar rail fence behind the barn, and they walked into the yard, and Marcel's mother came out onto the back porch with a tea towel in her hands, and looked at the two of them and said, "What in the name of the good Lord have you boys been into?" She said it because of the way they looked. Their trousers were soaked black at the knees from kneeling on the wet moss of the swamp. Their shirts were gray with the fine ancient dust of the chamber floor. Marcel had a long red scrape across his belly from where the slab had caught him on the way out, and Davy had moss in his hair and a smudge of copper green across the palm of his right hand from where he had steadied himself against the niche when Marcel was lifting the object. But it was not really their clothes that made Marcel's mother say what she said, and it was not the scrape, and it was not the moss. It was, she would tell her own sister 3 days later in a low voice over coffee in the kitchen of the farm, it was the look on those two boys' faces. They had the look, she said, of boys who had been into something they should not have been into, and who knew it, and who had not yet decided whether they were going to tell. That look. Any mother knows that look. And so she did what mothers in that country and in that century did when they saw that look on a child. She did not ask, she did not press, she did not even raise her voice. She said, "Come inside, both of you. Take off those filthy clothes. Wash your hands at the sink. Sit down at the table, and when you're ready, you will tell me what happened." And then she went back inside and put the kettle on. Marcel and Davy washed their hands at the sink. They sat down at the kitchen table. They drank the cocoa Marcel's mother poured for them. They ate the slice of bread with butter and brown sugar she set down in front of each of them. They looked at each other across the table. They looked at their hands. They looked at Marcel's mother, who was standing at the stove with her back to them, stirring a pot of soup that did not need stirring, giving them the room and the time to find their own words. And it was Davy, after a long while, who finally said it. Davy said, "Auntie, we found a room." Marcel's mother turned around from the stove very slowly. She looked at the two of them at her kitchen table. She wiped her hands on her apron. She came over and sat down at the head of the table between them. She said, "Where?" Marcel said, "In the cedar swamp, in the place we are not supposed to go." Marcel's mother did not say anything for a long moment. She did not scold them for having gone there. She did not even look surprised. She looked, Davy would remember many years later, the way a person looks when they have just had a fear confirmed that they had been carrying around all their lives without quite knowing they were carrying it. She said, "Tell me." And Marcel told her, and Davy filled in the parts. Marcel left out, and between the two of them they told her about the slabs in the moss, and the hollow underneath, and the opening, and the cold air that smelled like the inside of a stone church, and the flagstone floor, and the coursed walls, and the 3 bands of markings, and the stone bench, and the stone basin, and the niche, and the copper object, and the long slow breath that came up out of the small round hole in the floor. They did not embellish, they did not exaggerate, they were not that kind of children. They told her exactly what they had seen. Marcel's mother listened all the way through without interrupting. When they were done, she sat for a long time with her hands flat on the table in front of her. Then she got up and walked to the back door and called out across the yard to the barn for Marcel's father. Marcel's father came in from the barn. He was a big, quiet man, the kind of farmer who said 3 sentences in a day and meant all of them. Marcel's mother sat him down at the table and told him what the boys had told her, slowly, calmly, in her own words, with the boys nodding from time to time when she got a detail right. Marcel's father listened to the whole thing the way he listened to the weather report on the radio, with his eyes on the table and his hands wrapped around a cup of tea that his wife had set in front of him without his asking. When she was done, he did not say anything for a long time. Then he stood up. He said to the boys, "You will not go back to that swamp. You will not tell anyone else what you have told us. You will not tell your friends at school. You will not tell your cousins at the family supper on Sunday. You will not tell the priest at confession. You will not even tell each other when there are other people around. Do you understand me?" And the boys, both of them, said, "Yes, Papa. Yes, Uncle. We understand." And Marcel's father nodded once and put on his hat and walked out of the kitchen and out across the yard and got into the half-ton truck that was parked beside the barn and drove off down the gravel concession in the direction of the village. He came back about 2 hours later. He had been, Marcel's mother would later tell Davy's mother, to see the constable in the village. He had not told the constable everything. He had told the constable that the boys had found what looked like an old root cellar or an old still site something man-made and predating the family's tenure on the land, in a part of the bush that was not on Tremblay property at all, but on a long uncleared section of crown land that ran north of the farm. He had asked the constable, since this was crown land and since it might be of some historical interest, whether the constable could come up tomorrow and have a look at it and decide whether it was the kind of thing that ought to be reported to anyone further up the line. The constable had said he would come up first thing in the morning. The constable had said he was glad Marcel's father had come to him directly and not gone over his head. The constable had said, between the two of them, that it was probably nothing, probably some old-timer's potato seller from before the war, but that, of course, they would have a look. The constable came up the next morning. He was a man in his late 40s, a veteran, a quiet, careful, decent man, whose name does not need to be in this story. Marcel's father took him out across the hayfield, over the fence, up across the lion's back, down into the cedar swamp. The two boys were not allowed to come along. They stayed in the kitchen with Marcel's mother, and they worked on the chores she gave them to do, peeling potatoes, churning butter, mending the seam on a flour sack that had split, and they did not speak about the chamber, and they did not look at each other, and they waited. Marcel's father and the constable were gone for almost 3 hours. When they came back walking slowly, side by side, neither of them speaking. They came into the kitchen. The constable sat down at the table. Marcel's mother poured him a cup of coffee without asking. The constable wrapped both hands around the cup. He looked at the cup for a long time. Then he looked up at Marcel's mother and then at the two boys, who were standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the parlor trying very hard not to be noticed, and he said, in a voice that was kind but very serious, "Boys, I want you to come over here and sit down at the table. I want to ask you some questions, and I want you to answer me truthfully. Can you do that for me?" And the boys said, "Yes, sir." And they sat down. The constable asked them again to describe what they had seen. He asked them slowly, carefully, one detail at a time, with his hands wrapped around the coffee cup and his eyes on the table, and his voice never rising above the level of an ordinary conversation. He asked about the slabs. He asked about the opening. He asked about the cold air. He asked about the floor and the walls and the markings. He asked very carefully about the markings, and he had the boys describe each band of them in turn, the verticals and the curves, and the squares and the triangles, and the small cross and the small circle with the dot inside it. And at one point he took a pencil out of his shirt pocket and slid a piece of paper from Marcel's mother's grocery list pad across the table, and asked the boys, between them, to try to draw what they had seen. The boys drew. Marcel drew the squares and triangles. Davy drew the fish. Neither of them could quite get the verticals right because there had been so many of them in such an irregular grouping, but they did their best. The constable looked at the drawings for a long time. He folded the paper carefully into quarters. He put it in his shirt pocket. He buttoned the pocket. He took a long drink of his coffee. He said, "Boys, did you bring anything back?" And the boys said, "No, sir, we brought nothing back." He said, "Are you sure? Did you maybe pick something up and put it in a pocket without thinking about it?" The boys turned out their pockets onto the table. There were 2 apple stems, a piece of binder twine, the jackknife, the tin of matches with 3 matches left. Nothing else. The constable nodded. He said, "All right." He said, "I want you to listen to me very carefully now." He said, "What you found out there in the swamp, you did not find. Do you understand me?" The boys did not understand him. They looked at him. He said it again in the same kind, quiet, careful voice. "You did not find anything in the swamp yesterday. There is no room in the swamp. There is no chamber in the swamp. There is no door in the moss. You walked into the swamp because you should not have walked into the swamp. You got dirty, you got cold, you got scared by an owl or a snake or your own shadows, and you came home. That is what happened yesterday. That is what's going to have happened yesterday from now on for the rest of your lives. And if anyone at all ever asks you what you found in the swamp on Tuesday, that is what you will say. Is that clear? The boys, who were children, but who had grown up on farms in the years just after a war, and who knew the sound of a grown man telling them something for their own good, said, "Yes, sir." The constable said, "Good." He said, "Your father and I are going to take care of the rest of this. There are some people who are going to come up here in the next few days, maybe in the next few weeks, and they are going to ask some questions of your father and your mother and your uncle and your aunt, and they may even want to ask some questions of you, and you will answer those questions exactly the same way you would answer the question now from me, which is that you did not find anything, that there is nothing in the swamp, that you do not know what they are talking about. Is that clear?" The boys said, "Yes, sir." The constable said, "Good." He finished his coffee. He thanked Marcel's mother for it. He put on his hat. He left. What had happened in the cedar swamp during those 3 hours when Marcel's father and the constable had been gone, neither Marcel nor Davy ever knew with any certainty. What they were able to piece together over the years, from things their father and their uncle would let slip in unguarded moments, was that the constable had taken one look at the depression in the moss and the corner of the slab, and had said almost nothing for the rest of the walk. They had not gone down through the opening. They had not even uncovered it. The constable had walked the perimeter of the depression. He had measured it with the pace of his boots, 14 long strides one way, 8 the other. He had taken note of the orientation of the slabs, the way the long axis of the chamber ran east to west. He had taken note of the cedars growing around the site, the oldest of which, by his estimate, were perhaps 200 years old, which meant that the chamber, if it was in fact a chamber, and not some natural rock formation that the boys had, overinterpreted, had been closed long enough for a 200-year-old cedar forest to grow up around it. He had stood for a long time at the edge of the depression, and he had looked down at his boots, the way a man does when he is thinking very hard about something he does not want to think about. Then he had said to Marcel's father, in a voice that Marcel's father would describe years later as the voice of a man who has just realized that the day he has been dreading for 30 years has finally arrived. He had said, "I have to make a telephone call." The telephone call the constable made that afternoon was not made from the village. It was made from a private line at the home of the township reeve, an older man who had served in the First War as well as the Second, who lived in a big stone house on the edge of the village, and who was known among the constabulary as a man who could be trusted with the kind of information that did not belong in any official report. The constable used the reeve's telephone to place a long-distance call to a number in Ottawa. He spoke for less than 10 minutes. He did not say very much. He gave the location of the property by lot and concession. He described the depression and the slabs. He mentioned, very briefly, the markings the boys had described, the squares and the triangles, and the small cross and the small circle with the dot. Inside it, he said at one point the words, "It matches." He listened for a while. He said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Yes, sir," again. He said, "Understood." He hung up. He told the reeve, who had been standing in the next room pretending not to listen, that some people would be coming up from Ottawa in the next few days, and that the reeve would be receiving instructions about how to receive them. The reeve nodded. The constable went home. 3 days later, on the Friday morning, 2 cars came up the gravel. Concession rode from the south. They were both black. They were both newer and cleaner than any of the cars the people of the township owned. They pulled into the Tremblay farmyard at about 10 in the morning. 4 men got out. 2 of them were wearing dark suits. One of them was wearing a tweed jacket over a clerical collar, although Marcel's father, who watched the men get out of the cars through the window of the barn loft, would say later that he did not believe for 1 minute that the man in the clerical collar was a priest, because no priest he had ever known walked the way that man walked. The 4th man was wearing the work clothes of a surveyor, with a long canvas case slung over his shoulder. They did not knock on the door of the farmhouse. They walked up to the back porch, where Marcel's mother was waiting for them with her apron on and her hair pulled back, because the constable had come by the night before and told her to expect them. And one of the men in the dark suit said, "Good morning, Mrs. Tremblay. May we come in?" And Marcel's mother said, "Yes, you may," and held the door open, and the four men walked into her kitchen and sat down at her table. They were polite, the four men from Ottawa. They were extremely polite. They thanked Marcel's mother for the coffee she poured them. They complimented her on the kitchen, on the white curtains at the window, on the smell of the fresh bread cooling on the rack on the sideboard. They asked after the health of the family. They asked after the harvest. They did not, for the first half hour of the conversation, ask anything at all about the swamp, or the chamber, or the boys, who were upstairs in Marcel's bedroom, with the door closed under strict instructions from Marcel's mother to stay there until they were called, and not to make a sound. The men talked about ordinary things, the weather, the price of milk, the new tractor Marcel's father was thinking of buying, the road improvements the township was planning for the following spring, and then very gently, very smoothly, the way a fisherman lets out a line, the man in the dark suit who had been doing most of the talking, a tall man with thin gray hair and very pale blue eyes, and a soft accent that Marcel's father could not quite place, but that he thought might have been from somewhere in the maritime provinces. The man set down his coffee cup and said, "Now, Mr. Tremblay, I understand your boy and his cousin have been wandering a bit further into the bush than they should have, and have given you and your wife rather a fright. Tell us about that, if you would." What Marcel's father told them, sitting at his own kitchen table with his big hands wrapped around a coffee cup that was much too small for them, was what the constable had instructed him to tell them, which was a slightly more elaborate version of the story the constable had pressed onto the boys the day before. The boys had wandered into the cedar swamp. The boys had thought they had found something. The boys had come home shaken and dirty. Marcel's father had gone out the next day with the constable to have a look at what the boys claimed to have found. They had found, Marcel's father said, an old depression in the moss and a piece of stone that looked vaguely like it might have been worked, but was probably just a natural slab that had been glacially shaped, and certainly nothing to write home about. Probably an old still site from Prohibition days. Probably an old root cellar from before the family had bought the farm. Probably nothing. The boys, Marcel's father said, had imaginations, the way boys do, and had built it up in their minds into something it was not, but he was confident, having seen the place himself, that there was nothing of any real interest out there. The man in the dark suit listened to all of this without interrupting. When Marcel's father was finished, the man with the pale blue eyes smiled a very small smile, the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes, and he said, "That is very good of you to say, Mr. Tremblay. Now, sir, I wonder if you would mind very much taking us out to have a look at this depression, this not very interesting depression, ourselves. We have come a long way, you see, and the surveyor here has brought his equipment, and it would settle a small matter for our office back in Ottawa if we could just go and have a look. You will have it back to your supper hour without any difficulty at all." Marcel's father, who was not a stupid man and who knew when the polite request was not actually a request, put on his work boots and his hat and walked the four men from Ottawa out across the hayfield. The boys watched from Marcel's bedroom window. They saw the small procession crossing the field, their father in front, then the surveyor with his canvas case, then the two men in the dark suits walking side by side, then the man in the clerical collar bringing up the rear, and they watched until the five of them passed under the trees at the back of the field and were gone. They were not gone for 3 hours this time. They were gone for 7. They did not come back until almost 5 in the afternoon, when the boys had been called down for an early supper and were halfway through their plates of boiled potatoes and pork and beans, eating in silence under their mother's watchful eye. The men came in through the back door together. They thanked Marcel's mother again for her hospitality. The man with the pale blue eyes said, "Mrs. Tremblay, we wonder if we might trouble you for a place to stay in the village for a few nights. We have 1 or 2 small matters to attend to in the area before we head back to Ottawa." Marcel's mother said, "The Reeve has a guest cottage behind his house that is sometimes let out to visiting clergy and surveyors and the like. I am sure he could be persuaded to make it available." The man with the pale blue eyes nodded as though this was exactly the answer he had expected to hear. They thanked her again. They left. The 2 black cars rolled back out of the farmyard and turned south down the gravel concession road and disappeared. What followed in the next 10 days was something that nobody in the township, then or since, has ever been able to fully reconstruct, because everyone who took part in it was sworn in one way or another to a silence that most of them kept until they died. What is known, in the careful way that small communities know things they are not supposed to know, is this: the Reeves guest cottage was occupied by the 4 men, and by 2 more who arrived on the Saturday for the better part of a week and a half. During those 10 days, a series of trucks came up the gravel road at night, with their headlights dimmed, carrying loads that nobody in the village was permitted to look at too closely. Some of the trucks were carrying fill, that much was certain, ordinary clay fill, of the kind that road crews use to grade a low spot in a concession. Some of them were carrying lumber, fresh sawn pine, in longboards. Some of them were carrying tools, the heavy kind of tools that one used not for farming, but for the kind of close stonework that a road crew did not usually do. And at least one of them, late on the Sunday night of the 2nd week, was a truck whose load was covered by a tarpaulin tied down with so many ropes that the man at the Reeves house who saw it pass was quite sure that whatever was under the tarpaulin had not been intended to be seen, even by accident, and was being carried away rather than brought in. The cedar swamp during those 10 days was closed to anyone who did not have business there. A small wooden sign was put up at the back of the Tremblay hayfield, on the line between the farm and the Crown land, reading, in painted black letters, "Dominion, survey in progress, no entry by order." The sign had no department name on it. It had no telephone number to call for permission. It had only the words, and the painted black border, and the assumption, which nobody in the township was inclined to challenge, that it meant exactly what it said. The men in the dark suits, and the surveyor, and the man in the clerical collar, and the 2 men who had joined them on the Saturday, were seen by various farmers going to and from the cedar swamp every day for those 10 days, but always from a distance, always crossing the back of the Tremblay hayfield in the early morning or the late evening, always carrying tools or boxes or canvas sheets, never speaking to anyone they passed, never lingering, never being available to be asked a question. On the 11th day, the truck stopped coming. The black cars left the Reeves guest cottage at first light. The wooden sign at the back of the Tremblay hayfield was taken down and burned in the Reeves wood stove. And the cedar swamp, when Marcel and Davy were finally permitted, almost a year later, in the summer of 1954, to go for a walk in the bush behind the farm, was as quiet and as green and as ordinary as it had ever been. The depression in the moss was gone. The slabs were gone. The cedars around the place where the chamber had been left standing, but the ground around them had been graded, gently, almost invisibly, so that where there had been a long, shallow, rectangular dip in the swamp floor, there was now a long, shallow, rectangular rise, planted over with sphagnum moss and sedge and small cedar seedlings, and the small ferns that grow in the shade of a cedar canopy. To the eye of a boy walking through the swamp, who did not already know what had been there was nothing to see. To the eye of a boy who had been there, who had stood inside the chamber, who had held the copper object in his hands, who had heard the long, slow breath come up out of the small round hole in the floor. The absence was almost worse than the presence had been. Marcel and Davy kept their promise. They did not talk about it. They did not talk about it at school, where, as the constable had predicted, there was a brief flurry of curiosity among the other children about the Dominion survey sign that had been seen at the back of the Tremblay farm. A flurry that the boys deflected by shrugging and saying they did not know anything about it. The men had not let them go up there. The men had said it was a matter of mineral rights or boundary lines or something boring to do with crown land. And the other children, who were also farm children, who also had grown up with the casual presence of Dominion business that was not the business of children, accepted this and moved on to other gossip within a week. The boys did not talk about it at family suppers, where, as the constable had also predicted, the aunts and uncles and cousins were curious for a few weeks, and then, in the way of large extended families with many other dramas to attend to, forgot. They did not talk about it at church, where the priest, who was a kind old French-Canadian man who had been in the township for 40 years, looked at the two boys with a particular sad attention, the first Sunday after the men from Ottawa had gone, an attention that Marcel would think back on years later and understand, but that at the time he did not understand, because boys do not always understand the looks the older men in their lives give them when something has happened that the older men cannot fix. They did not even, for a long time, talk about it to each other. The first summer after the chamber, the summer of 1954, they spent together as they always had, fishing the creek, building lean-tos, exploring the bush, but they did not, by an unspoken agreement, go anywhere near the cedar swamp. They avoided even the Lion's Back, the granite ridge from which they had first seen the swamp on that August afternoon. They stayed south of the creek. They told each other this was because there were better fishing holes south of the creek, which was true, but the truth underneath the truth was that neither of them wanted to look north toward the cedars. Neither of them wanted to feel the pull that the boys would later admit they had both felt every time they walked anywhere near that part of the bush. The pull of a thing they had seen and were not allowed to talk about. The pull of a place that had been closed, but not, they suspected, closed forever. The second summer after the chamber, the summer of 1955, Davy's mother remarried. Her new husband was a freight clerk in Toronto, a kind man, a widower, with a son of his own about Davy's age, and within a few months of the wedding, Davy and his mother moved out of the rented house, 3 concessions over from the Tremblay farm, and went south to live in a row house in the east end of Toronto, in a neighborhood of small brick houses and clotheslines, and Italian and Polish and Ukrainian families all newly arrived in the city, where Davy would finish his schooling, get a job at his stepfather's freight office, marry a young woman from his Catholic youth group, raise 3 children, retire at 65, and never once, for the rest of his life, set foot back in Hastings County. He did not even, when his uncle Marcel's father died in 1972, come back for the funeral. He sent a card, he sent flowers, he sent a letter that his wife wrote on his behalf, expressing his sorrow at not being able to attend due to a back trouble that all his family knew perfectly well was not really back trouble at all, but was something else, something Davy did not have words for and did not want to find the words for. He stayed in Toronto. He stayed in Toronto until he died in 2011 at the age of 69 in a hospital in Scarborough, with his daughter holding his hand. The one and only sentence he ever spoke to his daughter about the cedar swamp, the sentence she would later share with her own daughter and eventually, through a long quiet chain of relatives and friends of relatives, with the small number of researchers and writers who had begun, by then, to assemble fragments of this story, was the sentence about the breath. He said to his daughter, on what would turn out to be the second to last evening of his life, while she was sitting beside his hospital bed and he was drifting in and out of the soft gray edge of the painkillers, he said, "You know, I always wondered what it was, the breathing. I always thought when I got to the end, maybe I would know. But I do not know. I still do not know." And his daughter, who had no idea what he was talking about, and would only find out, slowly, over the years that followed, what her father had been carrying inside himself all his life, kissed his forehead and said, "It is all right, Dad. You can rest now." Marcel stayed on the farm. Marcel grew up. Marcel married a young woman from one of the other French Canadian families in the township, a young woman whose family had farmed 3 concessions to the east of his own, and who he had known since they were both small children, and they had 4 sons of their own, and Marcel took over the family farm from his father in 1967, and worked the same fields his father had worked and his grandfather had worked, and grew older, and watched his own sons grow up and move away to the cities, and watched the township change around him as the bush was sold off in pieces to absentee owners from Toronto and from south of the border, as the old families died out one by one and their farms were broken up and their stone houses sold to weekenders, as the gravel concession road was paved in 1984, as the telephone lines reached every house, and then the cable lines, and then the internet lines, as the country he had grown up in turned, slowly, into a different country. And through all of it, Marcel kept his promise to the constable. He did not talk about the cedar swamp. He did not even, when his own 4 sons were old enough to be boys in the bush themselves, take them anywhere near it. He told them, the way his father had told him, that there were parts of the bush that were not for them, that the cedar swamp north of the Lion's Back was an old place, that they were to go around it on the east side on their way north, and that the smart thing was to leave the swamp itself alone. His sons obeyed him the way he had obeyed his own father, mostly. The youngest of his 4 sons, a boy named Jean-Paul, born in 1969, did sneak up into the cedar swamp once in the summer of 1982, when he was 13 years old, with 2 friends from the village, on a dare. They found nothing. They found a quiet, green, perfectly ordinary cedar swamp, with sphagnum moss, and standing black water, and tall thin cedars growing very close together. They found no slabs. They found no depression. They found, if there was anything left to find, a long, shallow rise in the swamp floor that they did not even notice, because by then the moss and the sedge and the small cedars had grown over it so completely that it was, to a boy who did not know what he was looking for, indistinguishable from any of the other small undulations of the swamp floor. Jean-Paul came home that night, sunburned and tired, and told his father where he had been. Marcel, who was by then a man of 41, with gray at his temples and a deep weariness around his eyes, looked at his son for a long moment across the kitchen table. He said, "What did you find?" Jean-Paul said, "Papa, there is nothing there. There is just swamp." Marcel said, "That is good." He did not say anything else. He did not punish the boy for breaking the family rule about the cedar swamp. He did not even, his son would say years later when he was telling this part of the story to a writer who had come up from Toronto to ask questions, he did not even seem surprised. He seemed, his son said, relieved. But the cedar swamp was not the only place in the bush where such things had been found. That is what people who have begun in the last 20 years to look into this story have slowly come to understand. The chamber in the cedar swamp behind the Tremblay farm in Hastings County in 1953 was not a unique find. It was part of a pattern, a long, quiet, almost completely uncatalogued pattern of stone chambers, stone slabs, stone walls, stone alignments, stone basins, copper objects, and inscribed markings scattered across the southern edge of the Canadian Shield and the Great Lakes Basin, from the eastern edge of Quebec all the way west to Lake Superior and down into the upper peninsula of Michigan that has been turning up since the first European settlers cleared the first farmland in this country, and that has been quietly buried, in one way or another, almost every time it has been found. The cedar swamp was not the first. The cedar swamp was not the last. The cedar swamp was simply the one in 1953. Consider for a moment, before we go any further into this story, what was known and not known about the deep history of this country in the summer of 1953. The official history, the history that was taught in the schools and printed in the textbooks and assumed in the newspapers of the time, was a very short history. Canada, as a nation, was only 86 years old. The British and French settlement of the Canadian interior was, in 1953, only about 350 years old at its earliest, the founding of Quebec by Champlain in 1608. Before that, the official history said there had been the indigenous peoples, the Algonquins and the Hurons and the Iroquois and the Ojibwa and the others, who had been hunters and fishermen and small-scale farmers and traders, living in birch bark longhouses and wigwams, making their tools from stone and bone and copper, conducting their religious life around the cycles of the seasons and the spirits of the animals and the lakes. And before that, the official history said there had been a long quiet wilderness, populated only by the ancestors of those same indigenous peoples who had crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Asia at the end of the last ice age, perhaps 10,000 years ago, perhaps a little more, and had spread out across the unpopulated continent and become the various peoples that the French and the English encountered when they arrived. That was the official story. That was the story that the men in the dark suits and the man in the clerical collar would have grown up with at school. That was the story that the constable in the village had been taught when he was a boy, and that the reeve had been taught, and that Marcel's father had been taught when he was a small boy in the one-room schoolhouse 3 concessions over in the 1890s. That was the story. And yet, alongside that story, in the long quiet farms and the long quiet bush and the long quiet small towns of this country, another story had been turning up, piece by piece, generation by generation, for more than 200 years. Not a story told in books, not a story taught in schools, a story told in the lower voice, a story told by old farmers to their grandsons over a glass of whiskey on the back porch on a summer night, a story told by old loggers to the young men who came up to work the bush camps in the winter of their first year, a story told by old surveyors who had walked the backcountry lines in the 1870s and the 1880s and the 1890s, when there was no road and no fence and no telephone wire to break the long quiet of the bush, and who had seen things in that bush that they had not been able to put into their official reports because the official reports had no category for what they had seen. The story of the stone chambers, the story of the slabs that were not glacial, the story of the carvings that were not aboriginal in any style that any anthropologist of the time recognized, the story of the copper objects in the niches in the walls, the story, in short, of an older Canada underneath the Canada that everyone was supposed to know about. The first time in the official written record that a stone chamber of this kind was mentioned in what is now Ontario was in 1776, when a Loyalist family clearing land near what is now Brockville broke through the roof of one with a plow. They reported it to the magistrate. The magistrate reported it up the line to the colonial administration in Quebec City. The colonial administration sent a young officer to have a look at it. The young officer made a sketch. The young officer's sketch, which survives in a private collection in England, shows a chamber not unlike the one Marcel and Davy would later describe, with a flagstone floor, a coursed stone wall, a niche, a stone basin, and a band of inscribed markings running around the wall at eye level. The officer's report, which also survives in a different collection in Edinburgh, recommended that the chamber be sealed and not investigated further, on the grounds that it was, in his words, plainly the work of a people of considerable artistry and antiquity, of an origin that this writer cannot identify with any confidence, and of a nature that may not be conducive to the orderly settlement of his Majesty's loyal subjects in the upper country. The chamber, on the magistrate's order, was sealed. The loyalist family was paid a small sum for their trouble, and was instructed not to speak of the find. The chamber, by every account, is still there, under what is now a parking lot of a hardware store on the eastern edge of Brockville, on a piece of land that the township purchased from the family in the 1870s, for the express purpose, the deed records show, of preventing future excavation. That was 1776. In 1827, near a place called Petersburg, in what is now Waterloo County, a German Mennonite farmer breaking new ground for a wheat field broke through the roof of another such chamber. He, too, reported it. The local Mennonite elders, who were not in the habit of consulting with colonial authorities about anything if they could avoid it, went out to look at the chamber themselves before any government official was called in. What the elders saw is recorded in a small private journal kept by one of them, a man named Jacob Schmidt, whose great-great-granddaughter would eventually donate the journal to the archives of a small Mennonite college in southern Ontario, where it sat unread on a shelf for almost 100 years until a graduate student stumbled across it in the late 1990s. Schmidt's journal describes a chamber, in his words, of stones cut as fine as the stones of the cathedral at Strasbourg, with marks upon the walls of a kind I have never seen and that none of our elders has seen, and with a great basin of stone in the center of the floor, and a niche in the eastern wall containing a copper plate worked in a fine fashion, with the marks of the walls repeated upon it. Schmidt and the other elders, after some discussion, agreed among themselves to seal the chamber and tell no one. The farmer was sworn to silence. The wheat field was planted over the top of the chamber. The story was not even told within the Mennonite community for more than a generation. Schmidt's journal, which was written in Old German script, and which describes the find in only a few pages out of a journal that runs to many hundreds, was not noticed by anyone outside his own family for almost a century and a half. In 1866, during the small gold rush in Hastings County that had brought hundreds of prospectors into the very hills where Marcel and Davy would later be born, a prospector named Hiram Calder, working a small claim about 14 miles north and west of the Tremblay farm, broke through into what he described in a letter to his brother in Kingston as a finished room of cut and fitted stone beneath the surface of the bush. Calder's letter, which has been preserved among the papers of his brother's descendants, and which only came to light in 2004 when the family was clearing out the attic of an old house in Kingston before selling it, describes a chamber strikingly similar to the one the boys would later find. Coursed walls, flagstone floor, a niche with a copper object in it, 3 bands of inscribed markings, verticals at the top, curving lines in the middle, geometric shapes at the bottom. Calder, in the letter, asks his brother for advice on what to do with the find. He writes that he has not told the other prospectors on the claim. He writes that he is concerned that if word of the find gets out, his claim will be taken away from him by the larger mining companies, or worse, by the government, on the grounds of historical interest. He asks his brother, who is a clerk in a Kingston law office, to make discreet inquiries about whether such a find could be kept confidential and the gold continue to be worked around it. The brother's reply does not survive. What does survive is a second letter from Calder dated about 6 weeks after the first, in which Calder writes that he has made the decision to seal the chamber himself, with timber and clay, and to say nothing about it to anyone. He writes that he has had bad dreams since finding the place. He writes that his partner, a man named McAllister, has refused to go anywhere near the part of the claim where the chamber was located. He writes that the gold itself, which had been promising in the early weeks of the claim, has since the discovery of the chamber become very poor, as though, he writes, the bush itself does not want us here once we have seen what is underneath it. Calder abandoned the claim within a year. He went back to Kingston. He died in 1881 of pneumonia. The location of his claim is recorded in the provincial mining records. It is, by every estimate that has been made, almost exactly 12 miles in a straight line north and west of the depression, in the cedar swamp behind what would, 87 years later, become the Tremblay Farm. In 1904, during the construction of the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway through the Canadian Shield, north of North Bay, a work crew dynamiting a cutting through a granite ridge broke into a sealed chamber set deep into the living rock of the ridge itself. This find, because it occurred in the course of a major public works project, could not be quite as completely hidden as the earlier finds. There are newspaper accounts of it. A small notice ran in the Toronto Globe of June the 3rd, 1904, describing the discovery of what the article called a curious cave of dressed stone, evidently of considerable antiquity, in the course of railway construction near Latchford. The article quoted the foreman of the work crew as saying that the chamber had been found to contain various artifacts of copper and stone, and that the artifacts had been forwarded to the proper authorities in Toronto for examination. The article promised that further details would follow as the examination progressed. No further details ever ran. The artifacts, when researchers in the 1980s tried to track them down through the records of the museum to which they had presumably been forwarded, were untraceable. There was no record of their arrival. There was no record of their cataloging. There was no record of their disposition. They had, by every official paper trail anyone could follow, simply ceased to exist between the moment they were loaded onto a train in Latchford in the summer of 1904 and the moment they were supposedly delivered to the museum in Toronto a few days later. The railway cutting itself, after the chamber had been emptied of whatever the work crew had found in it, was filled in with rock fill and concrete, and the line was rerouted around it by a distance of about 300 yards. The cutting is still visible from the train if one knows where to look. A slight scar in the granite ridge a few miles north of Latchford, sealed and silent, with the new line curving away from it in a long lazy bend that engineers of the period, in their internal correspondence, justified on the grounds of geological instability of the original cutting. There are others. There are many others. There is the chamber that was found in 1921 near Bancroft, about 30 miles north of the Tremblay Farm, by a road crew widening the highway, and that was filled in within a week of its discovery on the orders of the Provincial Department of Highways, with no record of its existence in any provincial archive that anyone has been able to find. There is the chamber that was found in 1937 near Maddock, almost exactly halfway between the Tremblay Farm and the old Calder claim, by a farmer named Sutherland, whose field was being plowed for the first time after a long fallow period, a chamber that the Sutherland family kept secret for 2 generations before the great-grandson of the original Sutherland began, in the early 2000s, to speak about it cautiously to a few researchers. There is the chamber, or what is reported to have been a chamber, found in 1947, near a small lake in the bush, north of Calidar, by a survey crew working for the Ontario Hydroelectric Commission, a chamber whose location was reported to the head office in Toronto, and whose subsequent history nobody outside that head office has ever been able to trace. There is the chamber found in 1961 near Tweed, about 20 miles south of the Tremblay Farm, during the digging of foundations for a new school, a chamber whose discovery was reported in the local newspaper for exactly 1 issue, and then never mentioned in print again, and whose contents, by every account, were quietly transferred away in the night by men who arrived in dark cars and who were not, despite the assumptions of the local residents, employees of any provincial department that anyone could afterwards identify. The pattern, when you lay the finds out on a map of Ontario and you draw lines between them, is not random. The chambers are not scattered evenly across the province. They are concentrated. They are concentrated along the southern edge of the Canadian Shield, in a long curving band that runs from the eastern end of Lake Ontario, through Hastings and Lennox, and Addington, and Frontenac, and Renfrew counties, up into the highlands of what is now Algonquin Park, and west along the southern shore of Lake Nipissing and the northern shore of Lake Huron, all the way to the eastern edge of Lake Superior. They are concentrated, in other words, along the geological boundary between the soft sedimentary rocks of the lake plain and the hard old metamorphic rocks of the Shield, in a band of country that has been, for as long as anyone has been keeping records, the inland frontier of southern Canadian settlement. They are not in the open farmland to the south. They are not in the deep wilderness to the north. They are along the boundary, the long, ragged, fertile, rocky, and complicated boundary, where farms run up against forest and cleared land runs up against bush, in the kind of country where a farm boy can step off a hayfield and be in a wilderness within 5 minutes' walk. And they are concentrated within that band near water, near small lakes, near creeks, near, in the case of the cedar swamp behind the Tremblay farm, the headwaters of small streams that drain south toward Lake Ontario. They are concentrated, in short, in exactly the kind of places where a careful, settled, water-using, water-revering people might have lived long ago before anyone in the official record was paying any attention. The question of who built them, of who carved the slabs and dressed the flagstones, and inscribed the markings on the walls and left the copper objects in the niches, and then closed the chambers, and walked away, and left them to be slowly buried under the moss and the topsoil of the centuries, is a question that nobody has ever answered to anyone's full satisfaction. The official position of the provincial and federal authorities, on the rare occasions when any official has been pressed to say anything at all about the existence of such finds, has been to say that they are most likely the work of indigenous peoples of the old copper complex, a culture that flourished in the Great Lakes Basin between perhaps 4,000 and 1,200 years ago, that worked the native copper of the Lake Superior region into tools and ornaments using cold hammering techniques, and that left, in various places around the lakes, evidence of a level of metallurgical and artistic sophistication considerably higher than the level usually associated with the indigenous peoples encountered by the first European explorers in the 17th century. This is a perfectly respectable explanation. It is also, when you look at the chambers themselves, an explanation that does not quite fit. The old copper complex, by every archaeological account that has been published in the open scientific literature, did not build in dressed stone. The old copper complex worked in copper, in bone, in antler, in wood, in birch bark, in hide. The old copper complex did not, as far as the open record goes, cut flagstones to the tolerances of a Strasbourg cathedral. The old copper complex did not inscribe geometric markings into coarse sandstone walls. The old copper complex did not, in any site that has been openly excavated and published, leave behind chambers of the kind that two boys found in a cedar swamp in Hastings County in 1953. So either the old copper complex was considerably more sophisticated than the open record suggests, in which case the open record needs to be revised, or the chambers were built by somebody else, in which case we need to ask who. The other theories that have been advanced, in the careful, low-voiced way that such theories are advanced in this country, are several. There is the theory that the chambers are the work of pre-Columbian European visitors. There is the well-documented Norse settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows on the northern peninsula of Newfoundland, which is now accepted by the open archaeological community as evidence of Viking presence in North America around the year 1000. There is the much more controversial set of claims about Norse penetration into the interior of the continent, the rune stones of Minnesota and Oklahoma, the alleged mooring holes on the islands of Lake Superior, the alleged stone holes and altar sites scattered across the upper Midwest. There is the even more controversial set of claims about Irish monastic settlement, the so-called Col D theory, that suggests Irish monks of the early Christian period may have crossed the Atlantic in the centuries before the Norse and established small contemplative communities in the deep interior of North America. There is the theory about Phoenician and Carthaginian trade voyages along the Atlantic coast and up the St. Lawrence in the centuries before Christ. There is the theory about a much older and much larger civilization, one that flourished across what is now the eastern half of North America in the millennia before the last ice age receded fully, a civilization whose major centers were inundated by the rising sea levels and whose interior outposts were slowly abandoned as the climate shifted and the great forest grew back over the land they had once cleared. These theories range from the merely controversial to the deeply heterodox, and most of them have been dismissed at one time or another by the open academic establishment as the products of romantic imagination or of outright fraud. And yet the chambers exist, the slabs exist, the markings exist, the copper objects, the few of them that have escaped the dark cars and the night trucks and have made their way into private hands, exist. Something built these places, something inscribed these walls, something left these objects, and whatever that something was, it is not adequately accounted for by the official story of indigenous peoples crossing the Bering land bridge 10,000 years ago and slowly developing the cultures the Europeans encountered in the 17th century. That is the small, uncomfortable fact at the center of all of this. The official story does not quite cover it. The markings themselves, the three bands that Marcel and Davy saw on the walls of the chamber in the cedar swamp, have been compared by the small handful of researchers who have been quietly working on this material for the past several decades to a number of other inscription systems known from various corners of the ancient world. The vertical strokes in groups of 3 and 5 and 7 have been compared to the Ogham script of ancient Ireland and the British Isles, a script of vertical and horizontal strokes that was in use in the early centuries of the Christian era for ceremonial inscriptions on stone monuments. The curving lines and S-shapes and fish forms have been compared to early Phoenician and Punic scripts, to certain forms of the old North Arabian inscriptions, and to motifs found on Cretan and Mycenaean pottery of the late Bronze Age. The squares and triangles, and the small cross and the small circle with the dot inside it have been compared to certain forms of Berber writing, to the Tifinagh script of the Tuareg of the Central Sahara, and to certain symbols found on stone monuments in the Western Mediterranean and the Iberian Peninsula in the centuries before Christ. None of the comparisons are exact. None of them quite settle the question. What they do suggest, taken together, is a chamber whose builders were familiar, at some remove, with several different traditions of mark-making from various parts of the Old World, and who had blended those traditions into something of their own, something that does not match any single known script of the ancient world, but that draws, in its features, on a number of them, which is, of course, exactly what one would expect from a small isolated community of mixed origin that had been cut off from its various motherlands for a long time and that had developed its own version of an inherited tradition. The copper objects, the few that survive in private hands or in obscure regional museum collections that nobody has ever bothered to systematically catalog, have been subjected, on the rare occasions when their owners have permitted it, to metallurgical analysis. The results, in every case that has been openly published, have been the same. The copper is native copper, the kind that occurs in nodular form in the bedrock of the Lake Superior Basin. The working is cold hammering, the technique that the old copper complex is known to have used. But the level of finish, the precision of the inscription work, the geometric exactness of the forms, is considerably beyond what the published old copper complex sites have yielded. The objects look, to those few metallurgists who have been quietly shown them, like the products of an old copper complex that had access, somehow, to certain techniques of finish and inscription that the published record of that complex does not include, which is, again, exactly what one would expect if a small isolated community of mixed origin had blended an indigenous metallurgical tradition with techniques drawn from another tradition, perhaps a Mediterranean tradition, perhaps an Iberian tradition, perhaps something even older, into a hybrid practice that left objects of a kind that nobody who has only studied the open record would quite recognize. What we are left with then, when we put all of this together, when we lay out the chambers on the map and we list out the markings on the walls and we examine the copper objects in the niches and we trace the dark cars and the night trucks and the sealed cuttings and the buried sites across 2 centuries of Canadian history, what we are left with is the strong, the very strong, the almost overwhelming suggestion that there was, at some point in the deep past of this country, a people who lived along the southern edge of the Canadian Shield in small, careful communities, who built small, careful chambers in the bush near water, who inscribed those chambers with a mark, making tradition that drew on several Old World sources, who worked the native copper of the lakes with techniques considerably more refined than the open record would suggest, and who, for reasons we do not understand, at some point in their history, sealed up their chambers, gathered their few small movable possessions, and either left or were destroyed, leaving behind only their sealed and silent rooms in the moss of the cedar swamps and the granite ridges of this old land. That this people existed, that this people built these chambers, that the chambers are still there, under the moss, under the topsoil, under the parking lots, and the wheat fields, and the railway cuttings, and the highway shoulders, and the new schools of the modern country, sealed and silent and waiting. That is, when you sit with the evidence for long enough, when you trace the pattern carefully enough, when you let go of the comforting official story, long enough to actually look at what the records and the family memories and the careful work of the small handful of researchers actually shows, that is the conclusion that you find yourself drawn toward. There was somebody here before. There was somebody here before the Algonquins and the Hurons and the Iroquois of the 17th century, or alongside the ancestors of those peoples, or among them, or in some careful negotiation with them, somebody whose works are still in the ground under our feet, somebody whose breath, perhaps, is still in the deeper rooms beneath the rooms the boys saw, somebody whose story has been buried, deliberately, methodically, for as long as there have been authorities in this country with the power to bury such stories. And the question that follows from that conclusion, the only question that really matters in the end, is the question of why. Why has the burying been so persistent? Why have the dark cars and the night trucks come again and again, generation after generation, to seal up these places and to remove their contents and to grade over their roofs and to plant cedars over their tops? What is it about this older Canada underneath the new Canada that the authorities of the new Canada have so consistently decided that the new Canada must not be permitted to see? There are no good answers to that question. There are only guesses. There is the guess that the chambers contain physical evidence that would force a wholesale rewriting of the history of this continent, evidence that would have to be reconciled with the political and economic and legal arrangements that have been built on top of the official version of that history, evidence that would, in short, raise questions about treaties and land titles and sovereignty that nobody in any position of authority wants to see raised. There is the guess that the chambers contain religious or ceremonial material of a kind that would be of interest to organized religious bodies whose interests have, for various reasons, over various centuries, run parallel to the interests of the colonial authorities. There is the guess that the chambers contain material of a kind that someone somewhere in some long, quiet office in Ottawa or in London or in Rome has been collecting, has been adding to, has been studying in a long, quiet program of acquisition that has been going on for as long as the colonial authorities have been in this country, and that the boys in the cedar swamp in 1953 were not, by chance, the first ones to find a chamber, but were simply the latest in a long line of finders, the latest in a long line of small disturbances of the long, quiet program. There is the guess, the smallest guess, the guess that the boys themselves came closest to in their own quiet way, that the chambers are not closed because of what is in them, but because of what is under them, that the small round hole in the floor of the chamber, in the cedar swamp, and the long slow breath that came up out of it, and the deeper rooms that Marcel and Davy did not have time to find, are the thing that is really being sealed away, and that the cedar swamp and the Brockville parking lot and the Latchford railway cutting and all of the other sealed sites across this country are simply the closed doors at the top of a much longer set of stairs that goes down and further down into something that the country we live in is not yet ready to look at. Marcel Tremblay died in 2019 at the age of 78 on the farm where he had been born, in the upstairs bedroom that had been his since he was 11 years old. He had been ill for some time. Cancer, slow at first, then less slow. His sons had taken turns sitting with him in the last weeks. His youngest son, Jean-Paul, the boy who had snuck up into the cedar swamp on a dare in 1982, was with him on the last afternoon. The October light was coming through the bedroom window. The leaves on the maples in the front yard were yellow and gold. The wind was blowing the leaves loose in small soft showers. Marcel had been dozing for most of the afternoon. At about 4 o'clock, he opened his eyes and he looked at his son, and he said, in a voice that was very soft and very clear, "Jean-Paul, there is something I should tell you." And Jean-Paul said, "Papa, do not tire yourself." And Marcel said, "No, listen, I should have told you years ago. I should have told all of you." And he told his son in the slow, careful sentences of a man who had been holding something inside himself for 66 years and was finally letting it out. The whole story. The walk into the bush with Davy, the lion's back, the cedar swamp, the slab, the opening, the chamber, the flagstone floor, the coursed walls, the 3 bands of markings, the stone bench, the stone basin, the niche, the copper object, the long slow breath that came up out of the small round hole in the floor, the walk home, the constable, the men in the dark suits, the man in the clerical collar, the 10 days of trucks, the sealing of the chamber, the grading over of the swamp, the sign in the hayfield, the promise he had made and had kept for 66 years. Jean-Paul listened. He did not interrupt. He held his father's hand. When Marcel was finished, Marcel said, "I don't know what it was, Jean-Paul. I never knew, but I have thought about it every day of my life. I have wondered what they took out of there. I have wondered where it is now. I have wondered if there is anybody left anywhere in this country who knows the whole story." And Jean-Paul said, "Papa, I will find out. I do not know how, but I will find out." And Marcel smiled, a very small, tired old smile, and he said, "Don't promise me that. It is too much to ask of a son, Just remember the story. Just tell it when you can to someone you trust. That is enough. That is enough. He died about 3 hours later, just before sunset, with the October light still coming through the bedroom window and the wind still blowing the yellow leaves of the maples loose in the front yard. Jean-Paul did, in the years that followed his father's death, begin to find out. He began carefully. He began by writing down everything his father had told him in a notebook that he kept in the drawer of his own desk at his own house in the village, where he had moved when he had retired from his job as a township road foreman. He began by talking, very quietly, to a few of the older men in the township, the sons and grandsons of the men who had been there in 1953, the men who had seen the trucks come up the gravel road at night, the men who had seen the sign at the back of the Tremblay hayfield, the men whose fathers had whispered to them over a glass of whiskey on a back porch on a summer night that there was something not right about that part of the bush north of the Tremblay farm, and that the smart thing was to leave it alone. He began by tracking down, through a long, careful chain of relatives and old phone books and Christmas card lists, the daughter of his cousin Davy, the daughter who had been with Davy in the hospital in Scarborough on the second to last evening of his life, and who had heard the sentence about the breath. He began by reaching out very carefully through a researcher he had met by chance at a regional historical society meeting, to the small loose network of people across this country who have been quietly working on this material for many years, the people who have collected the Brockville sketches and the Schmidt journal and the Calder letters and the Latchford newspaper notices and the family memories of the Sutherland farm and the Tweed school and all the other small pieces of this very large quiet puzzle. He began, in short, to do what his father had asked him to do, which was to tell the story, when he could, to people he trusted. This story, the one you're listening to now, is one of the places where that careful, quiet work has eventually surfaced. It is not a complete story. It cannot be a complete story. The completest version of the story is still, by every account, in the long, quiet office in Ottawa, or in the long, quiet office in some other capital, where the records of the men in the dark suits and the man in the clerical collar are kept. The completest version of the story is in the copper object that the boys saw in the niche, an object which has not, as far as anyone in Jean-Paul's careful, loose network has been able to determine, ever been catalogued in any open museum collection in this country or any other. The completest version of the story is in the deeper rooms under the chamber, the rooms that Marcel and Davy did not have time to find, the rooms from which the long, slow breath came up out of the small round hole in the floor on a Tuesday afternoon in August of 1953. Those rooms, by every indication, are still there. The fill and the lumber and the cedars and the long, quiet decades of Ontario weather have closed the top of the stairway, but the stairway itself and the rooms it leads to, and whatever it is that breathes slowly, book in the deepest of those rooms, has not gone anywhere. The cedar swamp is still where it was. The Tremblay farm is still in the family, still farmed by Jean-Paul's older brother, who is now in his 70s himself, and who runs a small herd of beef cattle on the cleared land. The Lion's Back is still there, the long granite ridge, with its 3 humps coming up out of the moss, still looking, from the right angle on the right kind of August afternoon, like the shoulders of a great cat lying down. The bush has not changed. The bush in that part of the country does not change very much. The cedars grow. The cedars die. The cedars fall over. The moss closes over the fallen cedars. New cedars grow up out of the moss. Underneath it all, under the moss, and the sphagnum, and the standing black water, and the long quiet shade, the chamber is still there. The slabs are still there. The flagstone floor is still there. The coursed walls are still there. The 3 bands of markings are still there. The niche is still there. although the copper object that was in it on that August afternoon in 1953 is almost certainly no longer there. The stone basin is still there. The small round hole in the center of the floor is still there. The deeper rooms underneath are still there. And the long, slow breath of whatever it is that lives or sleeps or waits in the deepest of those deeper rooms is, if Marcel and Davy were right about what they heard, still there. If you ever find yourself driving north out of Belleville on a summer evening, on the kind of long, quiet, 2-lane highway that climbs gradually up through Hastings County into the southern edge of the Canadian Shield, with the maple bush opening out into hayfields and the hayfields closing back into bush, with the small white farmhouses sitting back from the road at the end of long gravel laneways, with the rocks coming up through the topsoil in long gray backs like the spines of sleeping animals. If you ever find yourself there on one of those evenings, with the light slanting low across the fields, and the small clouds of insects rising up off the warm pavement, and the smell of cut hay drifting in through the open window of your car, you may pass, without knowing it, within a few miles of the cedar swamp behind what is now a quiet beef cattle farm at the end of a long gravel concession road. You may pass, without knowing it, within a few miles of the place where two boys, on a Tuesday afternoon in 1953, stepped off a hayfield and into something this country has been trying not to remember ever since. You will not see any sign of it. There is no historical marker. There is no plaque. There is no roadside attraction. There is only the bush of cedar and pine and birch and granite outcrop, the bush that has been swallowing things in this country for as long as there have been things in this country to swallow. The bush keeps its secrets. The bush has been keeping this one for a very long time. And on a quiet summer evening, with the light slanting low across the fields, you might, if you were the kind of person who notices these things, feel the smallest pull, the smallest tug of something underneath the surface of this country that is not quite as settled, not quite as accounted for, not quite as known as the official story would have you believe. So tonight, as you lie there in the soft quiet of your own room, with the lights dim and your pillow soft and your breath slowing, the way breath slows when sleep is coming on, let your thoughts drift back, one last time, to that August afternoon in 1953. Picture the hayfield in the late summer light. Picture the two boys in their canvas sneakers and their patched trousers climbing the cedar rail fence behind the barn. Picture the long walk north through the bush, up over the lion's back, down into the green silence of the cedar swamp. Picture the slab in the moss, the triangular opening, the cool air rising up out of the dark with the smell of an old stone church. Picture the small cedar fire flickering on the flagstone floor of a chamber that should not exist, the 3 bands of markings on the coarse stone walls, the niche, the copper object, the long, slow breath coming up out of the small round hole in the floor. Picture the boys climbing back up into the soft green sunlight of the swamp, pulling the moss across the opening behind them, walking south through the bush, across the creek, through the hayfield, back to the small white farmhouse, with the wood smoke drifting low across the fields and the smell of supper on the stove, and a mother in an apron standing on the back porch with a tea towel in her hands. Picture the constable at the kitchen table with his coffee cup. Picture the men in the dark suits and the man in the clerical collar. Picture the trucks at night and the painted black letters on the wooden sign. Picture the long, quiet decades of silence that followed. Picture the cedar swamp closing over itself, the moss growing back, the cedars growing taller, the long, shallow rise where the long, shallow depression had been, smoothing itself out year by year under the soft Ontario rain. Picture the chamber still down there, still waiting, the slab still in place, the marking still on the walls, the small round hole in the floor still open to the deeper rooms below. Picture, if it pleases you, to picture the long, slow breath still rising and falling, very far below the moss, very far below the topsoil, very far below the long, quiet country that has built itself, mostly without knowing, on top of an older country whose story it has not yet been ready to tell. Picture all of this, and then let it go. Let the picture soften at the edges. Let the boys walk home into the soft amber light. Let the men in the dark suits drive away down the gravel road for the last time. Let the truck stop coming. Let the sign be taken down and burned. Let the cedar swamp settle. Let the moss grow over everything that was disturbed. Let the bush close itself back into its long, quiet keeping. Let the country settle into the long, quiet sleep it has always settled into when the stories have been told and the storytellers have grown tired and the listeners have begun to drift toward their own quiet beds, in their own quiet rooms, in their own quiet corners of this old and gentle land. Let your eyes close if they are not closed already. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breath slow. Let the weight of the day settle out of your body the way the fine dust settled out of the air of the chamber, over all those long decades, settling onto the flagstones, settling into the seams, settling into the small undisturbed places where nothing has moved in a very long time. Let your own small undisturbed places find each other in the dark. Let the long, slow breath of the chamber, very far below, the moss, very far below the cedars, very far below the bush of an old country that keeps more secrets than it will ever tell, become the long, slow breath of your own body. In and out, slower and slower, softer and softer, deeper and deeper, until the difference between the breath you are breathing and the breath that comes up out of the small round hole in the floor of a chamber in a cedar swamp in Hastings County in the long quiet bush of eastern Ontario is no difference at all, and you are sleeping, you are already mostly sleeping, and the country around you is sleeping with you, and the chamber is sleeping, and the bush is sleeping, and the boys in their canvas sneakers and their patched trousers are sleeping, and the constable is sleeping, and the men in the dark suits are sleeping, and the cedars are sleeping, and the moss is sleeping, and the small round hole in the floor is sleeping, and the long slow breath is sleeping, and you are sleeping gently, all the way down. Good night.